Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of cryptids horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. Something hunted my grandpa his whole life. Now it's after me. My grandpa told me a story, a confession, really, right before he died. This was 15 years ago. I had ended up alone with him in hospice, and he was lying in bed struggling to breathe. He said he needed to say something. He and some other kids had killed a boy at summer camp. Ezekiel. He didn't open his eyes, just held me and started talking, stopping every so often because he couldn't catch his breath. Growing up, my grandpa had gone to a summer camp way up north near the Canadian border. The camp was founded by Teddy Roosevelt, people said, and nice families from Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and even Chicago sent their boys there to toughen them up. My grandpa was 11 that summer. Ezekiel was younger, maybe 9 or 10. Ezekiel was a strange kid. He came from a farm in Minnesota and was going to camp on a scholarship. His family was deeply religious and didn't have a telephone, though nobody knew if that was on account of their beliefs or from being poor. They weren't Amish, but they were in the ballpark. The camp counselors didn't know what to do with the kid. They called him Ezzy and told him to tie knots and build fires, but Ezekiel would have none of that. He was probably sick of doing real chores on the farm. He definitely didn't need toughening up. Instead, he'd stay in the tent and write long letters and read his prayer book, muttering to himself like he was speaking in tongues. The camp had all kinds of Protestants and a few Catholics, but nothing like him, no faith healers or snake handlers. And the way he'd look at you could make your blood run cold. Looking back at it, Ezekiel was probably afraid, out in the woods with a bunch of rich kids, so he was leaning on his faith. Not that the other kids didn't give a shit. They bullied Ezekiel. It was fun, and it quickly got out of hand, the way it usually does when adults look the other way. The kids pretended to lay hands on Ezekiel and yelled gibberish, hid cigarette butts in his food, stole his letters and read them aloud at campfire, and wiped their asses with the pages. They did the same to his prayer book. Then one day, on a hike, some older boys took Ezekiel off the trail. It was a big pine forest, almost cold even though it was July, filled with the sound of birds and the wind. My grandpa didn't know what they did to him. He took no part. He swore to God. Whatever the older boys did, they took it too far. The rest of the day Ezekiel lay in his cot, his back to everyone else. The next morning was a Sunday, brilliant weather. The chapel sermon by the lake was about courageous acts of faith. My grandpa told himself that he was going to be brave, like Daniel in the lion's den. If he saw something wrong, he would speak up. He looked over at Ezekiel, who, like usual, wasn't listening. The kid was staring out at the lake and the ripples of blue-black water kicked up by the wind. They had morning swim that day, always ball-numbingly cold. But there was a water slide and a diving tower on a raft, and you could get used to the water after a couple minutes. Stop shivering at least. The boys were doing dives off the tower. The platform was about 15 feet above the water. My grandpa was in the lake, hugging the raft and watching his friends tumble through the air and fall headfirst into the water. To everyone's surprise, Ezekiel was up next, tiny and awkward, looking up on the top of the tower. Everyone quieted down. He stretched his hands out in front of him, bent his knees, and someone shouted something. My grandpa didn't catch what it was, but it knocked Ezekiel off balance. He tripped and fell off the ledge and landed face first onto the raft. They heard his skull break, like the sound of a large egg getting cracked open under a towel, watching him stupidly as he bounced back up and into the water, then looking at the empty diving platform, at the blood on the raft. the blood already thin and runny from mixing with the lake water. The shock passed. Then bedlam. People diving into the water, others running to the shore, whistles, screaming, water churning everywhere. The lake was very deep here, for safer diving, and the water quickly got inky black, starting at 4 or 5 feet down. Too much time passed. Finally, they pulled Ezekiel up and swam him to land. As they carried him out, his head fell back limply. His face was crushed in the middle, water dripping from the crown of the dead boy's head. It took a while to reach Ezekiel's parents. It turned out they did have a telephone, but a bad storm had knocked out the lines. They didn't get word until late, and, roads being what they were, wouldn't make it to the camp until the next day. What to do until then? There was no hospital nearby, no sheriff's office. The lodge was the only real building on the grounds, a 2-story log cabin supposedly built by pioneers with a dining hall attached. They put Ezekiel in the basement of the lodge since it was cool and dark down there, put him out on a table so he wouldn't have to be on the dirt floor, and put a handkerchief over his face so they wouldn't have to look at it. Then the thunderstorm that had been out west blew through east, a bad one with hail and pounding rain. All the tents got washed out by nightfall, and everyone had to sleep in the lodge, 50 or 60 kids in sleeping bags on the floor, all trying to fall asleep as fast as humanly possible, focusing on the sounds of the storm so their thoughts wouldn't drift down to the basement. My grandpa unluckily had ended up next to the basement door. As you can imagine, he wasn't sleeping well. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the blood on the raft. Ezekiel carried out from the water, his face. Boom! A loud crash. My grandpa sat up. Thunder? Nobody else moved. Even the counselors, who had stayed up late on the porch talking gloomily among themselves, men barely older than the boys, were now fast asleep. He looked out alone at the sea of sleeping bodies, the crash still humming in his ears. Then there was a thud, then another. Someone was walking up the basement stairs, the old wooden steps creaking under his weight. He reached the top step and paused, right behind the basement door. Then he went all the way back down. After a minute or two, he started up the stairs again, then back down again. 11 steps each way. My grandpa was furious. He figured one of the boys had snuck downstairs to look at the body or mess with it, and he found his flashlight and stood up and threw the basement door open. It was pitch black down there. Now he understood how literalness of that expression. In front of him was a darkness so complete that it felt heavy and liquid, like it would cover his hand in tar if he stuck his arm into it. He switched on his flashlight and dragged the beam down the steps, all 11, until he reached the bottom. Nothing. No one was down there. Just the circle of light from his flashlight on the basement wall opposite the stairs. Then Ezekiel walked into view, like he was stepping into a spotlight. Except it wasn't Ezekiel. This was his body. This was something else, pale, the handkerchief hanging off of his smashed-in face, and only one eye which saw nothing at all. My grandpa slammed the door shut. No one else had woken up. A deep, almost drugged sleep hung over the room. He felt so crazed with fear that he thought he might pass out. The bottom step creaked, then the next, and soon it reached the top and grew still, but only for a second. The doorknob turned, and the door inched open. My grandpa stepped back, whimpering, when an idea flashed through his mind. The prayer book. He ran to Ezekiel's bag nearby and opened it and grabbed the book, degraded from its recent mistreatment, and went back to the door, which was now wide open. Ezekiel was on the top step. He looked almost normal in the near-complete dark when the flashlight wasn't on him, like any other kid who had stepped into a shadow. Ezekiel grabbed the book from my grandpa, seeming to weigh it in his hands, to think something over. Then he turned and walked back downstairs. My grandpa shut the door and locked it, waited. Nothing happened. Silence. Then he grabbed his sleeping bag and brought it to the opposite side of the room, by the front door where it was wet from the storm. He lay in a puddle and waited for daylight. Ezekiel's parents came during breakfast. Their clothes were normal. His mother couldn't speak, but his father managed to thank them for letting Ezekiel rest with his prayer book the night before. If they noticed the book's condition, they didn't say anything. Then they drove off with their boy, and that was it. No lawsuit or anything. Different times. Once he finished, my grandpa stared up at the hospice ceiling. He didn't seem relieved for having told me. Then he looked fur, his dark blue eyes sunken deeply into his face. "I hear him," he said, "when it's quiet. Late at night. I hear him on the stairs. After we had Richard, it started. Got worse as I got older. I'm sorry," he said. "Now I'm here, and I hear him all the time." My grandpa died 15 years ago. For a long time I forgot about what he said. No memory at all. It's weird, I know, but you never want to remember your family members like they were at the very end. It's not them. They've already left the building, and it's some animal dying there instead. I recently became a father. We're all good. Mom's healthy. Baby's healthy and beautiful. We're hardly sleeping as we figure out how to take care of this little human. A lot of time spent in a dark, quiet house. Well, sometimes quiet. The things is, I'm hearing things. I'm embarrassed to admit it. When it does get quiet, and I'm the only one awake, I sometimes hear footsteps on the basement stairs. I hear the steps squeak, and they stop once I tune in, like it knows I'm listening. Then it starts up again. Not always, but often. And when I'm falling asleep in bed, I get the feeling we're not alone. It's the same feeling I had when I was with my grandpa in hospice, that someone was under the bed. I'm freaked out, honestly. I don't know what else to do but write this up. I don't want to pull anyone else into this mess, but I can't live alone all my life with it either. I don't know what else to do.
I'm sorry.
Second story. The mob found a way to bring back the dead. I don't know how Mr. Laraza discovered the place. I mean, it might as well be in Timbuktu, as secluded as it is, but somehow he did. He was a businessman before his mother died, and he took over the family and had dealings with some kind of logging corporation in Reno. He owned a lot of land in New England, and even used to let guys in the family bury bodies there. Maybe he owned the little mountaintop, too. He never used it much, only for real grudges, for guys who royally pissed him off. He wasn't too big on killing, and tried his best to find other ways to punish people who screwed with him, but occasionally he got mad enough to order a hit. And 9 times out of 10, he was already so worked up he had the body buried at the place. Only a few guys in the family knew about the place, and would rather get hot and heavy with their grandmothers than go up there. One old dog even had a heart attack when Mr. Laraza ordered him up, or so little Jimmy Vario says. Jimmy's my father's cousin, a broad man with a squat face, pug nose, beady black eyes, and a Dick Tracy fashion sense. My father didn't really like him, but I was mesmerized by him growing up. He lived a few houses down from us, and always had new cars, nice clothes, women way out of his league, and fistfuls of cash. He used to hand out hundreds to neighborhood kids like it was candy. He took me under his wing when I was around 13 or 14 and introduced me to the Gazippy crew. They owned a few legit businesses like a bar and a pizzeria, and I started out with honest work, sweeping the floors, mopping up, running errands. Soon I was trusted enough by the capo to do other things like run messages, pick up protection money, things like that. Dad hated it, but by the time I was 16 he gave in and told me to live how I wanted. I moved in with Jimmy and started serious work with the family. After about 5 years, I was reporting directly to Mr. Laraza. an arrangement that only Jimmy, Tony DeSimone, and a few others were afforded. I, like most of the family, didn't know about the place until September '88. In August, an associate in the Marcelivano crew, a half-Italian/half-Irish mongrel named Joey Hill, was arrested for drug manufacture and sale and copped a plea with the DA. He'd get a reduced sentence if he helped their little organized crime investigation. The entire crew ended up going to jail, and even Mr. LaRazza was arrested, but released for lack of evidence. Joey got out on bail one weekend and came by the suite, a lounge Jimmy and Tony D. jointly owned in those days, like nothing happened, assuming, I guess, we didn't have moles in the department. The idiot wasn't even 6 steps in when Tony D. whipped out his .44 Bulldog and put 5 in his chest. I was there that day, having a drink at the end of the bar with Tony's nephew, David. He was about 18 then, a few years younger than me, and we were pretty good friends. We just came in for a quick nightcap after Benny Castell's 16th birthday party. He was Mr. LaRazza's nephew, so it was a real bash. Benny, who later joined the FBI and got killed by some religious cult, was with us, but he left about 15 minutes before Joey came in. David had never seen a man killed before and sat there in dumb shock as his uncle and my cousin stood over Joey's body laughing. I tried to console him or something, squeezing his shoulder and telling him what a piece of fucking dirt Joey was. But Tony told me to go call Mr. LaRazza, and I ran off to the back office and dialed his personal number. When I told him what had just happened, his voice grew tight. "The rat's fucked?" "Yes, sir," I replied. He was quiet for a long time, most likely contemplating his extraordinary luck. "Tell Jimmy to keep the body in the freezer," he said, "and tomorrow, take it to the place." "What?" I asked. "Just tell Jimmy," he said and hung up. I gave the message to Jimmy, and his little eyes lit up. "I ain't going this time," Tony groused. "I got a date tomorrow." "That's okay," Jimmy said, clapping his large hand onto my shoulder. "I'll take Tommy here." "Where?" I asked. "To the place." "What's that?" "You'll see," Tony chuckled, and Jimmy grinned. They cleaned up the mess they made while I and David finished our drinks. Joey was a small guy, so Jimmy rolled him onto a sheet of plastic, wrapped him up, and dragged him off while Tony mopped up. The next day was pretty busy, and I didn't have much time to wonder about the place until it was almost time to go. Jimmy said that we would leave at 7, and by 6:30 we were having dinner at the suite. "So what the fuck's up with this place?" I asked as Jimmy attacked a rack of lamb. "Take it easy, will you?" he said around a mouthful. "You'll see later." By the time we were finished, it was almost 7, and curiosity had begun burning in my chest. We dragged the body from the freezer and zipped it up in a black NYPD body bag Tony got in bulk from a crooked cop buddy of his. David was there, and he went and got Jimmy's Pontiac and drove it around back. We loaded Joey into the trunk and ran David home. Tony was getting spiffed up for his date, but took the time to brew a pot of coffee for us. Dusk had deepened by the time we got away. We had to stop by the house to pick up a few things, a shovel among them, of course, and we're leaving the city on the Throgs Neck Expressway 20 minutes later. Jimmy drove, and I sat shotgun. I had a metal station from Jersey on at first, but when that faded out after a crocus song, I switched it off and we rode in silence. The highway passes through many small New England villages and port towns, and I watched these blur by, enjoying the ride and the tranquil sounds of the tires humming on the pavement. We talked on and off, not about anything important. I tried to ask him about the place again, but he just looked at me, his face ghoulish in the green dash glow, and told me to wait and see. It took us forever to reach Maine. The dark highway just kept unfurling like a carpet to hell. I'd never been out of the state, well, Jersey, and the ride seemed eternal. Where the hell are we going? I asked after we crossed the border. The place, Jimmy evaded. I shook my head. We followed the craggy coast for hours before we passed through the city of Bangor and took a back road through the woods. We're getting close, Jimmy said. About 20 minutes later, we pulled off the highway and followed a little dirt road, eventually parking in a grassy clearing bathed in cold moonlight. All right, Jimmy said, killing the engine. We got out and went around to the trunk. He popped it open and handed me the shovel. There's a path, he said, mostly uphill. We should be there in an hour or so. He dragged the bag out and flopped it carelessly aside. He reached into the trunk, came back with a long-handled flashlight, and clicked it on, dust motes swirling in the bright beam. On the way up, he said, sweeping the trunk with the light, if something talks to you, just ignore it. For a moment I didn't understand. Huh. On the path, he removed a red gas can and slammed the lid. If you hear something talking to you, don't pay it any mind. What the fuck would talk to me? Jimmy took the shovel and zipped that and the gas can up in the body bag. Nothing. That's just it. Ignore it. Loons. Sound carries and plays tricks on your mind. Now help me with this asshole. Jimmy grabbed one end and I the other. Once we were situated, we began walking through the snarled weeds to the path. So, where the hell are going, anyway? Cursed Indian burial ground or something, he said. What? I asked. Cursed burial ground? Yeah, it's the soil, Jimmy replied. Makes the dead rise. What? Yeah, some evil spirit in the ground or something. Gets in bodies and infests them, you know? Jimmy, don't bullshit me. We reached the forest. Shifting the bag, Jimmy pulled out the flashlight and clicked it back on. Ahead, a worn dirt trail curved up and out of sight between the towering pines. Honest, he finally said as we started up, I seen it with my own eyes. You put someone in, they come back? Bullshit. Really? You bury him in the ground, and they come back. They're all stupid and drooling, but, you know, alive. Shut up. I swear to God, Jimmy solemnly returned. Yeah, whatever. The trek through the forest from there was a misery. Occasionally, we'd come across a fallen tree and have to scramble over. Jimmy, carrying Joey over his shoulder like a fireman would carry an unconscious woman from a burning row house. In one spot, a large section of the path had been washed away, and the fall was at least 50 feet down onto the carpeted forest floor. Jimmy tossed Joey across and inched along an outcropping of ledge left behind. I'm usually not afraid of heights, but I sure as hell was then. My heart crashing and my stomach rolling. I squeezed my eyes shut and shuffled over, my arms held out for balance like a high-wire artist. But worse were the voices, babbling from the undergrowth like the river Styx over bleached skulls. I don't know when they started, but all at once I realized that half-formed words were being whispered to me from the darkness. Jimmy? My heart was throbbing, my breath hot and shallow. Just loons, he said reassuringly. No, I replied, those aren't. Sure they are. I opened my mouth, but before I could reply a chilling wail rose sharply behind us, hitching and shivering like demonic laughter. My heart halted as both I and Jimmy froze. What the fuck was that? Jimmy, still holding a corner of the bag with one hand, slowly swiveled his head, his face bloodless and his eyes wide. It's a loon. Just a loon. It came again, this time further, fainter. That's not a fucking loon. I looked tremblingly over my shoulder. The path stood empty in the moonlight filtering through the treetops. I fumbled for my gun. Loon. It's just a loon. Everything's fine. Jimmy sounded more sober. Now come on. Heart sputtering, I fell in line, glancing often over my shoulder. When we emerged from the forest 10 minutes later, a small chunk of dark weight melted from my chest. I hate you, Jimmy. I panted. I hate you. Jimmy laughed. I hate you. I hope you get whacked tomorrow. If I do, you just bring me up here, okay? He laughed. I'll be back on the street collecting shy money by dinner time. We crossed a large rocky butte, canted like the deck of a sinking ocean liner, a few dead trees twisting from the thin soil like ghoulish hands. Through another stand of gray wood we found another path, this one gravel, and followed it up the steep hillside. The summit was barren, save for piles of stones glowing in the light of the waning moon. Some were perfectly arranged in neat piles, but others lie strewn about like blasted rubble. I looked over my shoulder. Far below, the tops of dark pines fell away to a distant river, gleaming silver. On the other bank, a white church spire rose in rural beauty. I was surprised how clear the view was. Okay, Jimmy said, startling me, and dropped Joey. I let go, rubbed my hands on my coat as though they were foul, and stepped back. Jimmy bent, unzipped the bag, and pulled the shovel and gaskin out. You just hang out, he told me. I'll dig Dummy's grave. Okay, I said, pulling my gun from its shoulder rig. I looked warily around me. Jimmy rolled up his sleeves and started digging. I stood over him, watching, smoking, and nervously sweeping them out with the gun. All right, he grunted about 15 minutes later. He pulled Joey out of the bag and rolled him into the shallow pit with his foot. You fill it in while I go get some rocks, he told me, and then left me alone. Now totally calm, I finished my cigarette and then started hefting clods of dirt onto Joey. I looked over my shoulder when I heard Jimmy coming. You want all the dirt in? Yeah. What do you think? I dunno. The shit's magic, ain't it? Fuck you, Jimmy said, taking offense to the sarcasm in my voice. Get out of the way. He took the shovel from me and did it himself. I stood aside and smoked another cigarette, watching him and thinking. I didn't think he was lying to me. Let's just get that out up front. But how the fuck was I supposed to believe that a dead guy was going to get out of the ground? I didn't. I couldn't. What was this? Some kind of elaborate rite of passage or something? Hell, maybe those voices in the woods really belonged to guys in the family. Maybe they were trying to make me shit myself. No, that wasn't right. The look of absolute terror on Jimmy's face when that thing started screaming, that was real. Jimmy's an awful actor, and an even worse liar. Tony told me a few times that if Jimmy ever got caught, the cops wouldn't even have to use a polygraph to know he wasn't being honest. If that wasn't it, then what the fuck? Was he being serious? Was Joey really going to come back? When Jimmy was done, he piled the rocks in a crude pyramid on top the grave. Done and done, he said, dusting his hands like they were two chalk erasers. He dragged a few pieces of wood from the night, arranged them much like the rocks, and then touched a bundle of dry grass off with his Zippo. The fire, though feeble, was much better than the ghastly glow of the moon. We might have to wait a while, Jimmy said, easing down with a grunt. It varies, but it usually takes 20 minutes or so. So, you're being serious? I mean, this is gonna happen? Jimmy sighed. No, we're just standing guard so the animals don't get him. Of course it is. Why the fuck you think we drove 50,000 miles into the middle of nowhere? I grasped for a reply. You think I'm shitting you, but just wait until this asshole comes back. You'll see then. We were quiet for a while. What am I going to see? What the hell's the point in all this anyway? The point, Jimmy said, lighting a cigarette, is that this dickface gets to get whacked more than once. Just blasting him ain't good enough. I guess that made sense. Sort of. But how do you kill what's already dead? Shut up with the questions, will you? You'll see. For a long while we smoked in silence, gazing into the soul of the fire and lost in our own thoughts. More than half an hour must have passed before I heard the furtive Rocky scraping at my left. Even then, I don't think I really believed that Joey was going to come back. I just couldn't make myself truly accept it. When I first heard it, I guess I thought Jimmy was trying to light his Zippo. I was looking up at the moon, so I didn't see him. Ah, there he is. Inexplicably, my heart sank. I looked at Jimmy, who was grinning like lunatic. What? He sang a parody of that oldie, My Boyfriend's Back. I glanced over at the mound, just in time to see a few stones tumble down. The fuck? I muttered, my throat suddenly tight and my heart starting to crash. If it were a movie, this would be the scene where loud music plays as the camera zooms in and out on my slack face real fast as all kinds of psychedelic shit swirls and flashes in the background. Jimmy laughed. Spider-like. A white hand stained with dirt burst from the depths of the cairn. I jumped to my feet with a breathless cry of terror. Jimmy flicked his latest cigarette, but into the fire and got to his feet. "Joey!" he cried, throwing open his arms as he strutted over to the cairn, from which stuck a wiggling forearm. "What's going on?" At the graveside, he pulled back his left leg and lashed out at the hand. A soulless screech came from the mound, and I fell back a few steps, panting and nauseous with horror. Jimmy bent, picked up a rock, and leered over the grave for a moment. Then he took a step back, and when he shifted his weight, I saw that Joey was sitting up, gazing dazedly off to his left. His head swiveled bonelessly, and he looked quizzically up at Jimmy. "Welcome back," Jimmy said, and brought the rock down so hard on Joey's head it split in half. The sickening crack of the dead man's skull sent shockwaves of disgust through me, and I turned away and puked. At last, I only dry wretched, my chest a mass of agony and my mouth acidic. I had fallen to my knees as the world grayed around me, and quickly got to my feet. Jimmy was already sitting by the fire, the rock heaped back in perfect order. I sank dazedly down across from him. Without a word, he produced a flask and handed it to me. I took a large sip. The alcohol was warm and tasted like cherries. When I was done, I handed it back. Jimmy, face stony and bizarre in the flickering glow, shook his head. "You need it more than me." I put it in my jacket pocket. "I guess I shouldn't have brought you here," he said solemnly. "Look, I'm sorry, it's just—" "Nah," he said, "it's fine. Some guys don't even make it this far. They run away down the path, and that's that." He smiled. "When I first came up here back in '62, I nearly shit myself. Literally. I had to go off." He motioned past me and let loose. He dreamily shook his head. "The trip-up's the worst part. We'll go back down after the sun comes up. Sound good?" I nodded. That sounded great. Soon, the rock pile beside me began crumbling again. I reacted a little calmer than I had before. I jumped to my feet and backed off like a man does when he finds a black widow in a dark corner. But I didn't puke. When Joey was sitting up, Jimmy kicked him in the chest so hard I heard the former's spine crack in half. Joey gurgled and gagged as Jimmy stood over him. "Having fun, rat?" Jimmy asked, and then stomped Joey's face in. The entire night passed thus. It was a pattern. Sit by the fire, kill Joey. Sit by the fire, kill Joey. Jimmy really was having fun. He stabbed Joey, shot Joey in the heart, threw a rock at Joey's head, injected Joey with some kind of poison, lobbed the top of Joey's head off with the shovel, got a running start and kicked Joey's head, garrote Joey with a rope. Finally, he started getting tired. "You want to get him next?" he asked heavily, slumping down across the fire. I shook my head. "No, you go ahead." He chuckled. "We done everything we can do to him. Let's just be you." He trailed off, perking, his eyes widening. That's it. For a half an hour he sat giddily in silence, waiting for Joey to get back up. As soon as he did, Jimmy shot him and got the gas can. Splashing the contents on Joey's inert form, he said, "Now let's see if ashes come back." They did. Got in my lungs and made me cough. They swirled around Jimmy's head, and he opened his mouth like a whale inhaling plankton. "I'ma shit him out tomorrow. Say hello to the other rats in the sewer for me, Joey." Joey won in the end. 2 years later, Jimmy got lung cancer and died. They said it was his smoking, but I kind of think Joey fucked up his lungs.
Infine.
Didn't breathe enough of him in. As for the place, I never went back there. I'd rather get walked into an empty room like Joe Pesci than go back to that fucking cemetery. Just as long as they didn't bring me back. Third story. In the 1970s, the mayor of my town invented a bizarre cryptid to attract tourists. I'm starting to think it wasn't made up. You've probably heard of Bigfoot, Mothman, and the like. Those are the ones who attract all of the cryptid chasers. What you haven't heard of, I bet, is the Bighorn Grove pine crawler. Most people haven't heard of Bighorn Grove at all, so that'll tell you how successful it was at reeling people in. I mean, Mothman is a neat idea. Big, red eyes, huge wings, all that cool stuff. And Bigfoot is a big ol' ape. Now that's a lot of fun. The pine crawler, he ain't that. The sightings describe him as having shaggy fur covering its head and torso, like one of them bearded collie dogs, but his limbs are hairless, scrawny, and twice the average dude's height, with claws big enough to wrap around trees, and a membrane between the limbs like the one that those flying squirrels have. You see them blurry pictures of Bigfoot walking by a tree or Mothman flying through the air. You wouldn't get that with the pine crawler. According to the stories, he used his freakishly long limbs to climb around the treetops and grab at its prey. But since our boy is nocturnal and he lurks at the top of the trees, nobody got any pictures of him. Imagine that, a cryptid without even a blurry image. Now that's just poor. The only real images were some sketches made from the witnesses' descriptions and a picture of the night sky and the treetops, taken by a witness right before it moved away from the camera. Let's talk about the witnesses in question, by the way. The mayor, Oliver Miller, had always been talking about how we needed more tourism in Bighorn Grove. The population of the town was around 2,000 in the 70s, and visitors weren't common. Mayor Miller thought that a lot of profit could be made from tourists, but we liked our town the way it was. Small, quiet. His attempts to attract tourists were known to us, however, so when his son, Michael, as well as his college-age friends witnessed the pine crawler for the first time in '71, everyone chalked it up to good old Miller seeking visitors. Sightings of the creature from elderly folk, teenagers, and drunks piled up over the next decade, none of which were taken seriously, of course. In '79, Miller unveiled a statue of the pine crawler, which was ridiculous considering that nobody outside of the town had ever heard of the thing. People passing by the statue took to calling it Ollie, after our dear old mayor. Around the start of the '80s, though, the killing started. A kid staying in his grandparents' cabin for the weekend claimed that his grandpa was carried into the forest while teaching him how to hunt. 2 days later, they found the body. His legs were broken, and it appeared that his heart had given out not long after the injury. The mayor tried to insinuate that the pine crawler was responsible, to which he received no small amount of backlash. The townsfolk consider themselves a rational lot. They figured that some kind of murderer was roaming the woods. A month later, a car was seen crashed into a tree on the roadside. The cops found the owner, a young woman, much further into the forest, also with her legs broken. The cops were slower to find her than a passing black bear, however. When a man went missing whilst on a camping trip 3 weeks after that, a huge search party went out into the forest that night. He was found with his legs broken and his head caved in on a rock. He, however, was found outside a cabin belonging to one George Anderson. George was a Vietnam veteran, and he'd always been a bit colder after coming home, but the few that were close to him would have never suspected him of doing something like this. But the chief of police was the nephew of the old man that had been killed. The mayor probably saw catching a killer as a way to get back in the people's good graces, and George had at most 4 friends. So they pinned the deaths on him, and he went to jail for the rest of his days. There weren't many sightings of the pine crawler after that. It was only passed around through story. I remember some guys I knew tried to make a short film about it when they were in college, but it got about 50 views on YouTube, and they took it down. I returned to Bighorn Grove recently because my dad passed away last week. Got mauled by a bear whilst on a hunting trip. No real way to sugarcoat it. I take some small comfort in the fact that he always joked that it's how he'd want to go out. Still, it's a bad way to go. I've seen The Revenant and Backcountry. After the funeral today, Jack invited me to come drink with him. Jack went through Vietnam with my dad, and he's always been like an uncle to me. We shared stories about him and laughed, while his granddaughter, Sarah, rolled her eyes at us. A bear, of all things. I sighed. Listen, kid. Jack said slowly. Kid, I'm 36. I laughed. No, really, kid. You gotta listen to this. I don't think a bear killed your pops. What do you mean, Jack? Ooh, he's gonna show you his conspiracy theories. Sarah teased. Shush now. This is serious, he snapped. He began to lead me downstairs to his basement. When the light flicked on, I was met with a wall with dozens of pictures pinned to it. Looking at them, I realized that they were pictures of a creature in the trees that fitted the description of the pine crawler. These weren't blurry, either. These looked to be taken with a real high-quality camera. It's real, kid. How long have you been collecting these, Jack? I asked him. Your father and I started gathering proof since George got locked up. We wanted to prove that the pine crawler did this, not him. You're saying that it killed all those people in the 80s? Why'd it stop? The old man thought that instead of driving to town for some food, he'd teach his grandson to hunt. Pine crawler didn't like its prey being taken, decided it'd teach him a lesson. The girl in the car? Thing didn't like the noise. Most people know not to drive through the forest at night anyways. The camper? Well, the pine crawler is smarter than your average bear. It saw that search parties were encroaching on its territory after the previous kills, so it snatched the camper and left him outside poor George's house to frame him. Then it stopped, because people don't go near the forest at night now, and it can eat all the animals it wants. You've really thought about this, haven't you? And you think it killed my dad? Kid, in the last couple of months, we noticed that it started killing predators recently. Wolves, mountain lions, bears. It's practically clearing the forest of them. I think that's why it killed your father while he was hunting. But why, Jack? Well, kid, I think it wants to make the area safe for its little one. Huh. He opened a box to reveal a large, reddish-brown egg. Jack, how'd you get this? I saw it in a tree this morning. I took a shot at the branch and it fell down. Thing barely got scratched, so I brought it back. As if to demonstrate its durability, he slammed down on it hard with his fist to no effect. I'm gonna figure out a way to destroy this egg, so we won't have to be dealing with a Pinecrawler Jr., stated Jack. Now I'm gonna go to bed. It's getting dark out. You can use the spare room. Rest sounds good. Neither of us were exactly sober, and he had just shown me some pretty strong proof of a monster existing. Despite my tiredness, I figured I'd write this down before I fall asleep. That was the plan, anyway, but Sarah just told me she saw some big animal outside. It could just be a bear or something, but I'm worried. I think that the Bighorn Grove Pinecrawler is real, and it wants its egg back. Fourth story. Who will believe my story about Mothman anyways? So I've not been on Reddit for very long. I'm going to be bold and skip the whole throwaway account thing and own this, but I'm definitely not typing this on my computer. I am going to instead narrate this on my smartphone because I'd never want anyone at work to know about this. I will explain why later, but to simply land the plane, I'm telling you I'm narrating this on my phone so that you will forgive any grammar or typo errors. Trust me, typos and grammatical errors bother me more than they bother the average person, as I am a college professor in the Midwest, and it makes me crazy to read papers with multiple mistakes. Seriously, I really do teach, and I promise you that the story is true, and it's about Mothman, if you've ever heard of him. Maybe this is the wrong place for true stories. Nonetheless, my older sister experienced the same thing I did one night during 1975 while traveling on the East Coast. I think I was about 10. That would make my sister 11. I'm telling this story now because it recently came up again in conversation. The first time we talked about it was about 5 years ago. I'm not sure why it took almost 35 years to come up in discussion for the first time. Neither of us recall choosing not to talk about what we both saw while parked overnight at a road stop in the hills of upstate New York. Maybe we just forgot? Not long after my mom died of an aneurysm, I was 14 and she was 15. Life from there forward was chaotic and crazy, and I was one sad human being. I digress. So as I said before, my sister and I recently talked about this. We rarely talked until recently. My sister had a stroke this past February, and it forced her to move back to our home state, and in the same city as me, to be cared for because she is paralyzed. I've spent a lot of time with her since then, just sitting and talking and getting to know her as an adult. Her left side is paralyzed, but she can speak very clearly. So naturally, we've been talking about a lot of things having to do with our childhood, and our shared Mothman experience came up once again. All right, I hope I've set the stage to move forward. Back in the 70s, it was not uncommon for people to travel across country each summer in their car or van. So naturally, my parents thought nothing of packing up their 3 children in a basic van with little more than one of those AAA trip tips you could get if you were a member of AAA. We traveled every summer. We'd gone camping in Mexico for a month one year, camping through Canada the next year, and so on. In 1975, however, my parents wanted to cover the eastern seaboard using our van as our means of transportation. We came up the coast from South Carolina to North Carolina and onward up to New York State. That's where it happened. My parents were cheap. Maybe that's not fair to say. My dad was a social worker and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, so we did things on a budget. Frequently, we would just pull over at a rest area, do our business in nature, and bunk down for the night right in the van. So this one night we are in the mountains of New York, stopped at a rest area that is basically a dirt and gravel parking lot. It was heavily forested, and we were the only family parked there for the night. If you're wondering how we all fit in the van, my parents were ingenious and strung hammocks for me and my sister. My parents and my baby sister, then, slept on the floor of the van using sleeping bags. So my sister and I are both laying in our hammocks. It's late, and everyone below us on the floor is sound asleep. Our heads are near the rear of the van, so we can see directly out of the front window into the forest. I'm laying there, just looking when I see two large orange orbs appear in front of the driver's seat. I know that no one is parked there because I peed in the woods in front of the van less than an hour before. I laid there silently, trying to figure out what the heck it was. I even looked out the rear of the van. We had tie-up curtains in our van, but it was so completely dark out that my parents didn't consider closing the curtains. Now, at this point, I'm not sure if my older sister is sleeping in the hammock next to me. I'm just looking at these orbs and frankly, I'm too terrified to make a sound. I start to make out the outline of a massive head. It looks like whatever it is standing on our front bumper. I move beyond terror and muster the gumption to start to cry. To my surprise, my older sister is awake and starts crying along with me. I begin calling for my mom. Internally, my mind is wondering whether what I'm seeing is scarier than the spanking I'm going to get for waking my parents for nothing. My mother is not budging, but neither is my dad. At this point, I would be okay with my dad yelling at me for waking him up. Maybe it would scare this thing away. I start howling louder, calling out for both of them to please wake up. Both remain sound asleep, along with my baby sister, who is sleeping between them. My sister joins me in calling out to both of them. The front driver's door opens, but the dome light does not go on. Whatever it is, it moves into her car and is seated in the driver's seat. I can clearly see an outline of it, and it turns around and looks at me. I would say that the orbs of its eyes were as big as grapefruits, bright orange. My older sister and I both react the same. We roll out of our hammocks, almost in sync with one another, and free fall, slamming on top of each of our parents. Neither parent stirs even a little, in spite of being slammed into in the middle of the night. No matter what, I can't wake anyone up. I remember laying next to my mom and crying, and then everything goes blank. My next memory is waking up in the morning next to my mom and practically squishing my baby sister, and being scolded by my dad for being on the floor instead of in my hammock. I am certain nobody woke up that night, but here is the thing. The front driver's side door was cracked open in the morning. My parents accuse us of getting out of the van in the middle of the night to go pee and forgetting to shut the door. I never left that man that night, nor did anyone else. Plus, I am absolutely certain the doors were not only shut, but were locked when we went to bed that night. I don't know what exactly I saw, but I have researched. My best guess is that I experienced what is referred to as Mothman. My sister has told me that she concurs with me. I feel foolish. I am a scientist. Yet I know what I saw. And I am not the only one to have seen what I saw. The first time we talked about it, my talented artistic older sister sketched what she saw. I know I saw the same thing. That's my story. It's 100% true. I am not a budding young writer, just someone who wants to share her story in hopes that I might gather more information from those of you reading this. So please let me know. And thank you. Fifth story. CCTV doesn't lie. The Mothman is back. To the streets and the skies of Chicago, blinking between buildings and gliding low over open water, picking up the odd animal or child and dropping it down until it goes splat against the pavement, hitting so hard its limbs fly off, causing general havoc and instilling fear into the hearts of those who walk the streets after the last rays of the sun have finally disappeared beneath the skyline. And I try to help capture it. Him? It? I'll just go with it. Anyway, keyword, tried. Morning, 3 days ago, I saw it, hovering above me, feeding. And by morning, I mean morning, ass crack of dawn morning. So fucking morning that I could still go to bed and get up at a semi-reasonable time morning. I was walking home from a late night out with the boys. Or morning, whatever. Anyway, I was stumbling home, down Western Avenue, The night was almost over, and I could see that tinge the sky gets right before the sun rises, and I stopped to look up, to admire the light gilding the skyscrapers when I saw it. A shape. A weird goddamn shape in the sky between the buildings. I looked around to see if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing. They weren't, because I was alone, totally alone, which was odd for the area I was in. I looked back up to see that the shape had turned and seemed to be looking at me, and I stared right on back, drunk, stupid. It suddenly swooped lower, towards me, like it wanted to see me better, and I held up a hand, shading my face, trying to see it better. And I did, and I gasped. It was a man with enormous wings, and for one wild, crazy fucking moment, I thought it might be an angel. A real, live goddamn angel. But then I saw the glowing red eyes and the dead thing hanging limply from the man's right hand, blood dripping from it. Splunk, 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 against the windshield of the car parked on the street next to me. And as it came closer, I realized it wasn't a man at all. It was something else, something alien, something man-like, but barely. It was watching me with its beady, evil-looking red eyes, and was chewing, slowly, slowly, like it was savoring the taste. It lifted the thing it was holding and took another rip out of the flesh, and then I heard it, mewling down to me, a weak cry. The thing it was eating was still alive. I turned and ran, hoping that what I saw was just an unspeakable hallucination brought on by too much beer. Next night, I saw it again. At work this time, 23 stories above Chicago. I work as a security guard for some high-tech computer company in the Loop. To be honest, I don't even know what they do. All I know is that it pays decently and offers benefits. But there are times when I'm walking through the building late at night, that I think to myself, maybe I don't want to know what these people do. Maybe it's better that way. Still, I always kept a flash drive with me, just in case I ever saw anything incriminating, something I might want a copy of. I was working a graveyard shift, of course, and was the only person in the building, of course. The first few hours went by like a breeze, but I was getting restless in my little room, sitting there, watching all the screens, making sure all the rooms I knew to be empty were really empty. I sighed and turned to look away, but something caught my eye. Something not extraordinarily unusual, but enough to make me do a double take. One of the screens was showing what looked like a static image. Usually one of the lights plugged near the computers up there would throb up bright, then die low again. But the image was showing just a faint light. Confused, I stood up and left to investigate. The light was located on the 23rd floor, so I took the elevator to the 22nd, then took the stairs the rest of the way, just in case there was something more nefarious going on and I needed to be quiet. The floor was dim when I entered, nothing unusual. My company likes to save as much energy as they can. I was just getting ready to make a sweep towards the light when I heard it, a small, sharp noise I've never heard before. Tick, 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 tick. My heart throbbed up to my throat as I turned the corner, expecting to see something horrific. There, near the window, was a dark shape, low to the ground, vaguely man-like. Suddenly it moved, and I saw it was a man, and he was holding what looked like a long stick in front of him. He reached out and turned something against his face, and suddenly I realized he was holding a sniper rifle and adjusting the sight. Tick, tick, tick. I stood by the doorway, scared still, wondering what to do, how he got in, when I heard a voice. It sounded slightly amused. "I can hear you breathing. Who are you? What are you doing in here?" "I'm security." He pushed himself up and turned towards me, the rifle held low in his hands, pointed at the ground. I unconsciously took a few steps back, afraid, then swallowed thickly and said again, "Who are you?" He threw the rifle up onto his shoulder and stood at ease. "To you. I'm Agent 42. Agent 42? Or spooky, I guess. Take your pick. Agent Spooky 42, okay. I looked him up and down again. He was wearing a balaclava, bulbous spectacles, and light tactical gear. All black. All ridiculous. Printed on the balaclava was the bottom half of a skull, except the teeth were different, longer, like a vampire's. Slung across his back was some sort of axe. Its blade glinted in the dim light. An array of weaponry and rope hung from his belt, including a grappling hook, carabiners, and what looked like sticky bombs. But none of those things grabbed my attention. It was what was hanging from his right hip that struck me. Is that a scabbard? He looked down at it, his face totally obscured by the specs and the balaclava, and sighed. Empty. Miss it. Miss it. The heft of it. The absurdity. Yeah. Look, I don't know what you're snorting, but you're on private property, and I'm going to have to call the police if you don't leave. Now. The guy laughed, and, despite it being muffled by the balaclava, it sounded real and hearty. After the shit MK Ultra did? Yeah, I'm not into drugs. He thought for a moment. Besides alcohol, of course, and caffeine, and maybe the occasional, jazz cigarette, for the night terrors and the flashbacks. I squinted at him, wholly consumed by confusion, until the thought of my job caught up with me again, and I shined my flashlight in his face, making him grunt and turn away. Who are you really, and what are you doing here? I'm really a super secret agent guy, and I'm here for that. Still shielding his eyes, he pointed at me, and for a split second I panicked before realizing he was actually pointing straight behind me at the windows. Tink, tink, tink. I turned around, slowly, expecting to see something fucked up, and I did. It was the Mothman. He was holding the severed head of what looked like a human child. He blinked, his red eyes boring into my soul, and as I watched, he tapped the head against the window again. The mouth gaped open and the teeth hit the glass. A fleck of red-tinged drool dripped out and slithered down the surface. Tink, tink, tink. Confident son of a bitch. I'll give him that. I tore my eyes away from it and looked back at the man. He was kneeling now, the rifle leaning against the desk beside him, his spectacles on the floor next to his feet. He shrugged off the axe and set it down, gently, then pulled off his balaclava, shoved it into a pocket, and ran a hand through his wood-colored hair. He stood up, grabbed the rifle, and said, "Come on." "Where?" "Up. Don't worry. He'll follow. He hates me." The man smiled winningly, then turned towards the elevator. "Should we use the stairs? Just in case?" "Fuck the stairs." We stood in an awkward silence as the elevator slowly made its way up and up towards the top level, where the ceiling was vaulted and there was room enough for battle. The man was checking the rifle, sliding parts in and out, popping bullets from his belt into his pocket for what I assume would be easier access. "So," he said, still looking at his rifle, making me start a little. "Any ideas?" "What?" "I need to catch him, keep him alive. We could build some sort of catapult and launch a missile at it, except instead of a missile, maybe we could use a net." The man snorted and muttered, "Catapult," under his breath. "What?" "Oh, I was just laughing at your suggestion of using a catapult. Clearly the superior missile launching system would be a trebuchet. Aren't they like the same thing?" The man looked at me dumbfounded, like he might openly slap me or something, and his mouth fluttered a bit as if he was about to burst out in an endless diatribe. Instead, he just shook his head and muttered, "Not worth it. It's not worth it." What's going on?" "Nothing. It's a good idea, but there's not enough time or material." "So what then?" The man sighed, long and heavy, then said, "Bait." We arrived on the 33rd floor and stepped out expecting chaos, but the Mothman wasn't there. The man didn't seem too bothered and muttered something under his breath I didn't quite catch. He pulled out a Gerber knife and then pulled up his pant leg and then looked at me, smiling. Care to donate your shirt? I'll buy you a drink. Sure, okay. Can I ask you a question first? Shoot. What the fuck is going on? What the fuck is that thing? That's 3 questions, but I'm feeling generous. That thing is the Mothman, and we are going to catch him, so he stops eating everything. Oh. Then, with nothing left to say, with most of my logic suspended, I lifted off my shirt and the man took it, then pulled his balaclava out, reached down with the knife and made a superficial cut on his calf, soaking up as much blood into the cloth as he could. He ripped a piece of his pant leg off and bandaged the wound. Job finished. He looked up and smiled at my expression. Moths, he said, wadding up the blood-soaked balaclava and shirt, are stupid. Mothman is basically just a giant moth. More moth than man. So, pretty stupid. All he really does is fly at people, stare at them, hover, and I guess murder and eat the occasional animal and, toddler. Oh, and there was that one time when people thought he made a bridge collapse, but nope. Just bad infrastructure and good timing on his part. I honestly don't know how he escaped. I'm thinking he didn't, that someone allowed him to escape. Escape? They caught him years ago. Caught? A weird, high-pitched song suddenly played out and I recognized it almost immediately. The man pulled out an extremely thin phone and flicked at it for a second, the light of it illuminating his face, shadowing his features. Galaga? He looked up at me, surprised, then grinned and nodded. Best game. Just some girls in Colorado. Look, man, if you need to answer a booty call or whatever. The man burst out laughing and said, No. Just, friends. Probably wondering where I am. This is much more important. Then a threesome? Sure, man. Whatever you say. The man, still smiling, shook his head and opened his mouth to speak, but was cut off by a tink, tink, tink. He sighed, slid his phone back into his pocket, then unclipped the rope and the grappling hook from his belt and slid them onto his right shoulder. You know, sometimes I wish they would just give me the go-ahead to fry the bastard, zap him right out of the sky. But no, they need him alive. Here, he held out the rifle and I took it from him with shaking hands. Sorry, he said, pulling out a pistol from his belt. I'll get my crew to fix it ASAP. They're, used to cleaning up after me. What? When the glass breaks, he'll fly inside and try to see what this is. He kicked the bloodied wad with his foot. Don't shoot him, unless you absolutely have to. You know how to shoot, right? I nodded, unable to say anything. Good. Ready? I nodded again. He fired at the glass. The bullet was blindingly bright, unnaturally bright, and too loud. So loud I didn't even hear the glass break. I squinted, unable to cover my ears since I was holding the rifle, and felt a sudden gust of wind swoop in. I opened my eyes, ready to fight, but there was nothing. Beside me the man said in a low voice, "Wait," and then, after a few tense moments, there it was. The head was gone. Instead it was holding 2 dismembered arms and swung them around as if they were some sort of sick batons or wands or something. It looked happy. It seemed to finally notice the window was open and approached it cautiously, clearly seeing me and the man standing there waiting for it. But then it saw the bloodied wad and whooped in excitement, approaching it slowly. Across the room, the man had started spinning and spinning the hook, holding back until the moment was just right. A kid? A goddamn kid. You bumbling fuck? The man released the hook and it swung in a wide arc, right on target, and all three of us watched it. It was like it was happening in slow motion. And then, like some mutant version of Ganon with enormous wings, the Mothman swung a dismembered arm like a bat, hitting the hook back towards the man so swiftly he had little time to react, and also, he didn't have a sword to hit it back with. "Well, shit," the man said right before the hook hit him full in the chest, flipping him over so that his head smacked against the floor, hard, knocking him out cold. What the Mothman did next still haunts me to this day. It laughed, voraciously, like it had never seen anything funnier. Its face crunched up and it bared its two few, strangely pointed teeth, sticking out a bluish tongue that flopped languidly and long from its mouth. And then it said, victoriously, like a child, "Spoopy go bye-bye. Spoopy Batman." It laughed again, dropped the arm, and swooped low, too low. "Hey, dude," I said, looking over the man, but he was lying prone on his stomach, his head turned away from me. "Hey, guy." "Bull." "Fucking spooky McSpooks. Wake the fuck up. It's fucking right there. What do I do?" I felt and heard it land behind me, the gust of its wings almost blowing me off balance. I turned and saw it in its entirety. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its wings were even larger than that. It had this jaundiced yellow skin that was peeling in places, leaving grotesque bloody splotches across its face. Its feet were not feet, but these weird tendrils that ended in one pointed, nail-less toe. And instead of 5 fingers it had 3, and they weren't fingers but long, sharp claws. "Ha ha ha," it said, looming over me, spittle flying from its mouth. I could see bits of what looked like a child's shirt patterned with tiny red boats stuck between its teeth. "I eat you now. I eat all of it. I never ate it before. They never let me. It tastes good." I bumped into a desk and stopped, remembering the rifle, holding it up. The Mothman hesitated, eyeing the barrel, then laughed again, like it knew I was too chicken shit to fire it. But I wasn't, and the sound of it cocking ricocheted around the room. It turned to run and bumped against the glass, then bumped into it again and again. A scream of rage echoed up and out of it as it tried to find the way out. "It's motherfucking glass, you dumb fuck. You can't go through it. And the opening is right there." I blasted the rifle. My aim was off. I was scared. I was shirtless. But it screamed in agony, clutched its left arm, and leapt out of the open window, soaring in an ungainly sort of way into the distance. Behind me I heard a ruffling sound and looked back to the man stirring awake. "Bravo," he said, sitting up, rubbing his head, then ouch. I kneeled next to him, setting the rifle down. "You okay?" "Yeah, I've had worse. Just dazed. Probably a bit concussed too." He shrugged, then winced. "Also, did you call me McSpooks? Or was that just a bad dream?" I laughed, shakily. Then he joined in and we laughed for a while until I remembered that we shouldn't be laughing at all, that I had just seen a real, live monster, that this man was indicative of something else, something sinister, something shadowy, hidden, conspiratorial. I stopped laughing and cleared my throat. "It got away." "Oh." He rubbed his head. "But, I realized there's still the tapes, the CCTV tapes. They might have caught something." The man thought for a moment, then opened his mouth. But before anything came out, a weird thin sound cut him off. It was his phone again, but it was whistling in a strange, haunting way. He pulled it out and I caught a brief glimpse of the screen. There was a strange emblem on it, an open eye with a mini pointed star as an iris. It blinked. "Really? Now?" He said more to himself than to me. Then, sorry, gotta run. I'll meet you in Wicker Park tomorrow, after your shift. Bring the tape. Next day, I went to work ready to steal the tape for that guy, but when I got there it was gone. I soon learned that not long before I had arrived, two men dressed in black suits had walked in and demanded all CCTV tapes be released to them. They said they were with some agency, that they had the authority. Apparently, the higher-ups immediately caved to their requests and relinquished them. Strange, I thought to myself, twirling the flash drive I always carried between my fingers. Super strange, then again. Maybe that guy sent them to retrieve it. Despite that thought, I still made my way over to Wicker Park after my shift and stood waiting by the fountain, checking my phone every so often. After a few minutes, I heard a voice behind me. Hey, have the tape? I turned. It was the guy. He was wearing a pristine black suit. What? The tape of the moth bud? These two guys, I think they were your co-workers. They came and took it. Thought you may have sent them. My co-fuck. He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up, a glazed expression crossing his face. His eyes suddenly snapped back to reality and he said, How long ago was that? I shrugged. Hours ago. He looked over towards the horizon. A pinkish hue was being swallowed up into the blackness above, between the skyscrapers. Parked next to the building across the street was a sleek black Nissan GTR Nismo. He seemed to be looking right at it. Damn. Well, I said, but the man didn't look over. He was still looking at the Nissan. There's still this. Downloaded it after you left last night, just in case. Or at least tried to. The man looked over, saw the flash drive and grinned, then said, Well done. There is a problem, though. I checked it and it's corrupt, but the file is there. Maybe we can, I dunno, do some fancy schmancy computer wizardry with it? Clean it up? Worth a shot. He held out his hand for it, but I hesitated. What are you going to do with it? The man was silent for a beat, looking into my eyes until I looked away. Finally, he said, You ever heard of a little thing called disclosure? What you mean what those crazy conspiracy theories are ranting about all the time? He nodded, but said, Oh, I wouldn't call all of them crazy. Yeah? Why's that? Between you and me, kid, I've seen some shit. Some bad shit. Shit that would change everything we knew about. Well, everything. Life. The universe. All that. But even if that were all true, and I'm definitely not saying it is, isn't there a possibility of society, losing their collective, shit? I suppose. I finally, freely, dropped the flash drive into his open palm, then said, And doesn't the thought of that scare you? The man nodded, slid the flash drive into his front pocket, and then said in a tired voice, Yes, but it's the only way.